with a quick intro. So this week we are taking a break from our reading and we're getting William Jefferies to present his book. It's just come out on War on the World Economy, Tech, Trade and Military Conflicts in a Deglobalizing World. So it sounds like there'll be plenty to discuss. Over to you, Bill.
Hello, everyone. Yeah, and thanks, Shane, for arranging this little opportunity to introduce my book, which is unfortunately very, very expensive. um, Therefore, if people do want a copy, then I can't officially give you one, but if you email me, I'll see what I can do. So I'll show you my email at the end. So if you do email me, there are ways and means, so to speak. Anyway, so thanks again for coming along today. So just to say a few words, what is the kind of idea of this project? And essentially, this has kind of been going on for 20 odd years, and it goes back to really the high-tech bubble of the late 90s. And I remember being a young lefty in the late 90s because our world was turned upside down. We had the collapse of the Soviet Union. I can remember in 1986, this sticks in my memory for some reason, listening to Radio 4, and they said the odds of the Berlin Wall collapsing by the end of the century are 200 to 1. They said back in 1986, obviously 2 years before it collapsed, and that completely changed the world. And I can remember that it took a long time for that kind of the significance of that to percolate through. So in the late 90s, there was the high tech bubble, and people, me included, assumed that this was going to be some disaster when this bubble burst and that there was going to be some massive deep crisis of capitalism. And of course, nothing happened at all. So the bubble burst in 2000 and essentially nothing happened. It recovered. China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, and then there was an incredible boom, which was called hyperglobalization latterly from 2001 2008. So it's trying to explain, therefore, what was the significance of this restoration of capitalism and really how this shaped really the world and globalization for really 30 years from the early 90s until now, essentially. And therefore looking at the political repercussions of that and the social repercussions, because as kind of Marxists, we have to have a social theory. We can't just attribute the marginalization of the left to the mistakes of the leaders, because the leaders have always been rubbish. I mean, they certainly are rubbish today, but they were rubbish back in the day as well. And that didn't mean there wasn't a big social movement. So you can't attribute the decline of the left to the leadership, because the leadership's always been bad, hasn't it? Or could have been better anyway. Let's put it like that. And therefore, we have to look at the social explanation. And the other thing that is kind of really so that explains the kind of long view, if you will, that I'll get onto into a second. And then the other thing is, of course, the accession of Trump to the presidency. Now, when I was writing the book, it was written before Trump acceded to power, but it's perfectly explicable Trump's turn, if you will, or rather, really acceleration of the process towards tariffs and deglobalization. If you look at the trends from, the last 10 years, all that Trump's really done is put rocket fuel underneath the whole process. He speeded it up, certainly, but the process was there already. And therefore it's necessary, if we want to understand it, we can't just attribute it to the kind of idiosyncrasies of Trump either. We need to look at the kind of historical processes that are going on. So this is the kind of motivation behind my book, and this is the reason for writing it. And therefore, if we can I mean, my conceit is, if you will, that if you can understand the reasons why globalization occurred, you can also therefore look at the limits to those reasons, why they won't go on forever. And therefore, you can say there will be at some point deglobalization. Now, back in 2001, when I was predicting this, and I got expelled from my Trotskyist group for saying the impact of China on the world economy is more important than Italy. Because at the time, China was the same size as Italy, according to the World Bank's GDP figures. And therefore, they said to me, aha, China's impact on the world economy is the same impact as Italy. I mean, it's a preposterous statement. But for disagreeing with that statement, I was expelled from my small Trotskyist group back in the day. And so, I mean, we have to laugh, don't we? But back then, I said that it was going to, that we won't really have a crisis until around 2017, I said, because I said, well, you take 1992 and then you add 25, essentially, and that gives you 2017. And obviously that was a bit compressed, but it was more or less, it's been, I think, proven more or less accurate as a kind of forecast. So let's just have a little look at the book, and we'll see what we do, where we go. Okay. Okay. So here we go. All right. So if we go back to 1989, Francis Fukuyama wrote a very famous article called "The End of History." And who was Francis Fukuyama? Francis Fukuyama was a Rand Institute analyst, and they kind of feature in my book because Rand Institute, or more precisely, the United States Air Force Project Rand, as it's called, is one of these American military think tanks. It was originally the OSS in World War II. Became transformed into the USAF Project Rand. And Fukuyama, he worked for Project Rand, and he wrote a famous paper called "The End of History" in 1989, and where he predicted that the collapse of the Soviet Union and the transition of China to the market was really the end of the alternative to liberal democracy as they saw it. Now, in terms of theory, it's really trivial. It's not really theory at all. But you have to say he got his timing right. So in terms of a forecast, it was very, very astute. And he said, perhaps this prospect of centuries of boredom at the end of history will serve to get history started once again. Because being he used to enjoy his job being a Cold War warrior, Francis Fukuyama. And with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the people like him, they didn't have their enemy anymore, so they had nothing to do. And so they all got bored. And I think that was true of a whole generation, actually, of Cold War warriors, that once they won the Cold War, they didn't know what to do. Anyway, he said, if we wait 300 years, people will get so bored that you'll get a recovery of the crisis. Obviously, we haven't had to wait 300 years. In fact, if you then look at Anthony Blinken, he said, a fierce competition, and this is last year, is underway to define a new age in international affairs. A small number of countries, principally Russia with the partnership of Iran and North Korea, as well as China, seek to erode the foundations of the United States' strength, its military and technological superiority, its dominant currency, and its unmatched network of alliances and partnerships. And so Anthony Blinken, I mean, it's good to go to the horse's mouth, I think. He says that there is this breakdown in what they call the international rules-based order. And what is this breakdown? Essentially, it's that China is now such a size, and we'll talk about China more, that it's no longer compatible with the international rules-based order, which was established initially after World War II and then was revived in the early 1990s. And therefore, this challenge is really the defining feature of the world today. And the point is, it doesn't matter whether China likes it or not. And in fact, it doesn't matter whether America likes it or not either. Just by its existence, it poses this challenge. And therefore, Donald Trump said tariff is the most beautiful word in the dictionary last year before he took power. And people say, oh, no one could have predicted that Donald Trump will do what he would do. But Donald Trump is, in fact, extremely candid about what he intends to do. You just have to take him at face value. He tells you exactly what he's going to do, and then he does it. And I think this is what people find difficult to understand about Trump, that in fact he actually carries out what he says. Now, this has been called, many people have called this polycrisis. Nouriel Roubini said this last year, but also Tooze said this. Other people have said this, and he says the world is on a precipice of such immense scale and urgency that these challenges threaten to destroy us. And this is called Thucydides' trap by kind of American military analysts and thinkers. And Thucydides obviously described the rise of Sparta challenging Athens in the ancient Greek world, and he sought to look for the laws that explained this challenge. Now, American military thinkers deny that there's any such thing as laws, and they deny that there's anything that's inevitable, because obviously if something's inevitable, it means it's lawful. If it's lawful, it can be understood. If it can be understood, then everything isn't merely a matter of subjective opinion and free will. So they deny that there's such a thing as laws and lawfulness as social phenomena, but nonetheless they say it's going to happen and the period is over that determined of globalization, and now we've entered into this period of the great power struggle. So how did we enter into it, and why have we entered into it? And this is what I want to answer in my book. Okay, so how do I do that? I apply a theory of long waves or long cycles, or what Parvus called Sturm and Drang. Now, who is Parvus? Parvus was a mate of Trotsky, essentially. So he was a Jewish revolutionary socialist in the 1890s. I think he was Polish German, but he was also attached to the Russians as well. And so there was a discussion about the so-called theory of collapse in the Second International, because there was a crisis in 1899, and some of the social democracy want to say that there's no such thing as collapse anymore, which was the Bernstein wing. Some said, and then the left, including Parvus, but also Kautsky, said, in fact, there will be a crash, but it won't be now. And they said, in 1899, there will be a crisis, but there's still great opportunities within the world economy. There's the opening of Africa, there's the opening of China, there's Russia's participation in the world, there's electrification, there's new technologies, etc., etc. And therefore, they said there'll be a crisis in 1899, then a recovery, then another crisis, which there was in 1905 to 1907, the financial crisis in the US. Then there'll be a recovery. Then there'll be a world war, they said. And then there'll be collapse. So you have to say, as a forecast, that's astonishingly prescient. And it seems to me that that is probably an accurate description of the next 20 years, if we're thinking about what the process will be. And the point is that these longer phases within the function of the economy explain the business cycle, how it operates. It doesn't do away with the business cycle, but it conditions it, it shapes it, it determines it. And so this is, Parvus said, and these commercial crises still take place and finally end in an economic depression, but this wasn't an immediate perspective, and not in the immediate short term for Parvus, in the longer to medium term. Okay, so if we look at this theory in the version that is provided by Ernest Mandel, who's kind of the most I'd say in my opinion, the best post-war Marxist. Um, anyway, he had a theory of long waves, which is not exactly the same as Parvasi's, but it's very similar, to be frank. And he was writing in 1995. He died in 1996, and he said, how could we escape the crisis years of the 1970s and 1980s? He said, a massive system shock, which combines a sharp rise in the rate of profit introduced by an even steeper rise in the rate of surplus value and a considerable broadening of the market. The latter could only occur in the present world situation through integration of the former USSR and the People's Republic of China into the capitalist world market. And he said he thought this was unlikely. But of course, it had already happened. I mean, I don't blame him particularly for his errors of forecasting, because he was still much closer than anyone else was. And after all, he'd been a revolutionary socialist since he was 17. He'd escaped from a concentration camp in World War II. And who wants to admit there's going to be a 30-year period of expansion the year before you die? Obviously. No one does, not least if you're a revolutionary socialist like Mandel was. But you can see that, in fact, by the mid-1990s, Russia was already in transition to the world market, and China, however you want to define it, we'll talk about that in a little minute, had undertaken market reforms during the 1990s, and it entered the World Trade Organization in 2001. So the conditions that Mandel described had already occurred by the time that he denied that they were going to happen. And now, if we want to link this theoretically, it's good to think about Marx's condition for the profit rate to fall, which is the key law, really. He says it's the most important law in political economy is the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. And that is absolutely correct. There is a tendency of the rate of profit to fall. However, that doesn't mean that the rate of profit is always falling. That's a mistake that people make. And Marx outlines 5 conditions in volume 3 under which the rate of profit can recover. And he says, and therefore he calls these counteracting tendencies. He says the falling rate of profit gives place to its opposite, namely to explain this fall is not greater and more rapid. There must be some counteracting influences at work which cross and annul the effect of the general law, and which give it merely the characteristic of a tendency, for which reason we have referred to the fall of general rate of profit as a tendency to fall. So what were they? Increase the intensity of exploitation, reduce wages below their value, cheapen elements of constant capital, expand the population that could be exploited by capital, and foreign trade. In fact, these are all the conditions that were created by the collapse of the Soviet Union and entry of China into the world market, however you want to define it. And therefore, what we have to say that Marx's theory predicts that the rate of profit must rise if it's, I mean, it might be wrong, Marx's theory. Yeah, fair enough. But if the rate of profit falls under these conditions, then Marx's theory is wrong. You can say that without any doubt. So, for example, if you take the transition of the former Soviet Union, Central Eastern Europe, and China to the market. So in 1989, remember that there'd already been market reforms by 1989. These figures are from European Bank of Reconstruction and Development. So if you look at, say, Russia, 5.3% of private sector output in total output in 1989, by 2000, 70%. Czech Republic, 11%, 80%. So massive increase in private sector production. Again, I'm not getting stressed about how you want to define the Soviet Union before 1989, but I'm simply saying it made a transition to the market during the 1990s. Okay, I call it a centrally planned economy for that reason. Before, and by the late 1990s, that centrally planned economy had ended. China shows a similar pattern. So if you take the reform period, which began in 1978, These figures are from the OECD. It was 3% of output at market exchanges in 1978 and 88% by the year 1999. So even more than the Soviet Union, or the former Soviet Union, transformed Russia. And so a huge proportion of output in China at market prices by the late 90s. Okay. So this, what did this mean? This was called by Richard Freeman. I mean, I called it as well, this great doubling, but obviously I got expelled from my small Trotskyist group. There was a great doubling. Richard Freeman got his paper published by the OECD, the National Bureau of Economic Research. So it just goes to show the circles you move in determine the reception of your message. The actual quality of the message doesn't change. You can have a very different result depending on whether you work for who you work for or what circles you move in. Anyway, so Richard Freeman said, you know, the amount of labor that could be exploited by capital rose from 1.46 billion to 2.93 billion during the 1990s. If we take, you know, the world population, roughly half go to work, half are children, ill, OAPs, blah, blah, blah. So roughly half of the working population are go to work. So that's more or less accurate, right? You don't have to worry about the exact numbers. So if the world population is 6 billion, if the world market spreads across the whole world, then obviously half of 6 is 3. Right, and therefore this is a doubling of the world population that can be exploited by capital. So what does that do? That, as Mark said, new populations, new markets, new workers that can be exploited. This is a key thing. So United Nations Conference Trade and Development said that the number of bilateral investment treaties increased tenfold, therefore, over this period. So you had a massive increase in trade, massive increase in the export of finance capital. And Paul Wolfowitz, who was a project of a new American century, very, very conservative American analyst, also a friend of Francis Fukuyama, one of the key architects of the US-Iraq war, said in 1992, the fundamentally new situation which has been created by the collapse of the Soviet Union, the disintegration of the internal as well as the external empire, and the discrediting of communism as an ideology with global pretensions and influence. So, I mean, you know, he's just saying what it was true, unfortunately from our perspective, but nonetheless true. Okay, so this also had a massive effect because people don't believe in socialism. They absolutely don't. I mean, when I was a kid, my friends, we weren't in any left-wing group, but we used to talk about socialism all the time. Now you have to be, it's very, very rare for that to be true. And if you look at tariffs, for example, so one of the key things that Marx points out as reducing the rate of profit fall is also an increase in trade. And you look at tariff barriers, essentially they collapsed during the 1990s. So there was a huge expansion in world trade. So therefore, these fulfill the conditions for a restoration of profit rates. So what do you have? If you're summarizing, massive extension of the world market, massive extension of new labor, massive reduction in barriers of trade, discrediting of socialism, massive reduction in labor militancy. So if you take, say, the UK, but this is also true of Europe, 1991 is the kind of key dividing line. Every year for strikes, every year after 1991 is lower than the lowest year before 1991 in terms of strikes, except in 2024 was the first time that has changed, right? So every year subsequently was lower than the lowest year previously. So huge change in labour militancy. Funny enough, in France, where they've always just chugged along the bottom, before 1991, they had the lowest strike figures in Europe. after 1991, they had the highest strike figures in Europe just because they didn't change very much. But yeah, so that's kind of interesting. So you had this establishment of global hegemon, so it's the US, obviously, technological revolution, a huge increase in the mass and the rate of profit as a result. Okay, so so why wasn't this measured? Okay, so I'm not going to waste a lot of time on this, but one of the key issues is how neoclassical economics shapes the data that is used by international agencies like the World Bank, IMF, United Nations, etc., etc. And essentially, they don't recognise it. Everything is a market economy, basically, right? So everything that is not a market economy is just a distorted market economy, and therefore they don't. So how did they measure the Soviet Union? Is the question, right? They just assumed it was a market economy, and this is called this is what I wrote my PhD on, which was another book that no one's read. But anyway, Abraham Bergson, he worked in the OSS. He worked for Kuznets and Leontiev, who founded the US system of national accounts. And so he essentially, what did he do? He assumed that the Soviet Union was a capitalist economy. He called this the adjusted factor cost. And then okay, so he just assumed the Soviet Union was a capitalist economy. And therefore, what happens when the plan collapses? Well, he's just already assumed it is capitalist. So you get a collapse of capitalism, right? It's measured as a collapse of capitalism. But it's not actually a collapse of capitalism. It's actually the creation of capitalism. So paradoxically, these figures invert or conceal the expansion of the world market, right? So in fact, the figures show the collapse of production in the Soviet Union, but in fact, this was a collapse of the plan and the creation of the market, right? It wasn't the collapse of the market. And so the figures kind of invert the real process. And this is also in Angus Madison's figures, who kind of tried to develop measures of output since the year 2000, 2000 BC, he said. And so how did he do it? He just assumed that they removed the distortions created by the command economy in order to just assume that the Soviet Union was, in fact, a capitalist economy all along. So that's kind of very important because it means that the figures of the collapse of the plan are measured as a collapse of the market instead of the creation of the market out of the collapse of the plan, and therefore they underestimate the growth of the world market by about half. I mean, the exact figure doesn't matter, but it's a huge, instead of a decline, it's a huge expansion in the 1990s. So that's the first thing. And so, in fact, you had if you think about you had the growth of the world population, doubling the world population, but also the means of production of the plan were stolen. They were not paid for, right? They were stolen by Russian capitalists, Western capitalists, some Chinese capitalists, right? They were not paid for. And therefore, if you think about the organic composition of capital, you have a huge increase in the labor force. You have capital, fixed capital, that is given to these capitalists for nothing. They don't pay for it. And therefore, you have an increase in the rate of profit, right? And so, and you think about it, you're talking about whole cities, right? For nothing. St. Petersburg, Moscow, Warsaw, Prague. Here, have that for nothing. That is going to revive your economy, isn't it? If you hand over a whole city for nothing. And then all of the infrastructure, the railways, the docks, the electricity, the dams, roads, everything handed over for the housing, handed over for nothing, right? To world capitalism. So this has a huge effect in reviving the world economy. And then, so by 2001, the transition economies account for 37% of world capitalist employment, 31% of aluminium, 44% of cement, 24% of steel, 16% of electricity, 8.5% of cars, 17% of GDP, and obviously this has increased since then. Yeah. So this was the immediate impact in the 1990s, and it's increased since then. So this was transformative. So that's the first thing about the statistics. The second thing about the statistics is this. I don't know if anyone reads the internet and Facebook, but I get harangued all the time about this. But essentially,
Right.
In the national accounts, they used something called net present value to try and estimate. I don't know, I teach accounts at university, and essentially you have two ways that you can value things. One is the past, what did it cost? And one is the future, how much money might it make, right? So if it's the past, that's called business accounting, fair enough. If it's the future, that's called economists accounting. Yeah, and that's called net present value. So what you do is you try and work out how much money you're going to make when you install this machine. And then you say, right, the value of the machine is how much money it's going to make you in the future. And that's called net present value. And in the literature, they call this the discounted aggregate of capital services, right? Which is very much a mouthful. And you can read about it if you want to in the OECD's manuals called Measuring Capital and Measuring Productivity, which I wouldn't recommend reading unless you really want to bore an evening and go to sleep. But nonetheless, if you want to understand the accounts, you can. And I know people don't read these things and they do go to sleep because they always tell me about them and they obviously haven't read them. Anyway, so the point is that if you have this as your cost of capital, right, it's way too big because profits are much higher than costs. And therefore, you're going to get a falling rate of profit when in fact you've got a rising rate of profit. Okay. And if you look at the statistics produced by various Marxists, they confuse what is called opportunity costs in neoclassical economics, but profits in the future with actual costs. And therefore their estimates of the rate of profit are frankly all wrong, to put it mildly. I've got another paper coming out of this. I'm not necessarily recommending you read it, but I've had one published on this and I've got another one. They just told me it was a good time. I've got another one coming out soon. I wrote it 2 years ago. I've completely forgotten about it and I got an email saying, oh, it's coming out. Anyway, it's good time. So this is a kind of important point if you're worried about the estimate of the rate of profit. So the OECD say the central economic relationship that links the income and production perspective to each other is a net present value condition. In a functioning market, the stock value of an asset is equal to the discounted stream of future benefits, that means profits, that the asset is expected to yield, an insight that goes back at least to Valois and Bohm-Bowerk. Benefits are understood here as the income of the value of capital services generated by the asset, or what they also call property income. In other words, rents, interest, and profits. Okay, so this is nothing to do with the amount of capital advanced, and therefore its use in measuring the estimating the rate of profit is completely wrong. Anyway, so anyway, I'll say enough about that. If you actually look at the rate of profits estimates, therefore, using these figures, it's all wrong. It just shows a constant fall in the rate of profit. Yeah. And particularly, according to this, the rate of profit fell particularly from kind of 2000, which is hyperglobalization. During the period of hyperglobalization, the fastest growth in the world economy ever from 2000 to 2008, according to these figures, the rate of profit fell. I mean, it's preposterous. But what can you do? This is from a paper of Basu, very widely shared paper produced by a Marxist economist, Marxist in inverted commas, economist. And he says that during hyperglobalization, the rate of profit fell. And in fact, Michael Roberts calls this a period of Great Depression, the fastest expansion of world capitalism in history is a period of Great Depression. Right, okay, whatever. So anyway, if you do try and work them out, and I'm not going to talk you through the how to do it. I've explained it at length in a paper. You see, in fact, that the rate of profit massively expanded. This is for the US. Since 2000, you had a huge growth in the rate of profit, which is exactly what you'd expect, of course, if you've got a period of hyper globalization. Yeah. And also no class struggles to speak of. Why? Because of everything that's going on within the world economy. See, it's exactly as you'd expect it to look. Anyway, so that is my estimate, and that's in the book. But enough said about that. Anyway, so then the other kind of element of this, and I'll hurry up, is to do with the rise of China. This is the key aspect, and this is what really destabilizes the kind of world international rules-based order, as the US put it. And China have what they call the China dream. Okay, and what's the China dream? That they are not oppressed by imperialists. It's very simple. So China was invaded by the Japanese in, I think it was 1934, and it was reinvaded several other times in the 1930s. And this was a really rapacious occupation. Millions and millions of people were killed, right? I mean, horrible occupation. And this ended with the victory of Mao in the Civil War in 1948. And this was obviously a huge step forward for China, the expulsion of the imperialists. So if you look at the figures for Korea, for example, there was also the war in Korea in 1949. The US killed 100,000 people in South Korea before the war started. So there's a real counter-revolutionary drive going on. So 100,000 people were killed in Korea before the war, right? And then the war occurred, and then Korea was divided. So China have this dream where they want to expel, fair enough, you'd say, and they also want equal rights within the international rules-based order, which is rights commensurate with their size and power. And America say this is totally unacceptable. For China, this is an outrageous affront to this is what, I'm not joking, I've got the quotes in my book. This is an outrageous idea that China should have equality in the international rules-based order. This is totally outrageous, according to American think tanks like the Rand Institute. Why? Because the international rules-based order is run by America, thank you very much. And America dominates the world, and China threatens American domination just by wanting equality. Okay, there you go. So that's very, very unambiguous. There's numerous documents where they explain this at great length, which I've quoted in my book. So you have this huge, really, movement in China in the 1990s towards the market. So the what is called the Iron Rice Bowl was abolished. 60 million state-owned workers were sacked in this period. 60 million. I mean, that is a lot of workers, right? So 60 million state-owned workers were sacked between about 1992 and 1998 in China, in this move towards the market economy. And then China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, and there was a huge expansion of China. Down the south coast, special economic zones, they were called SEZs, where initially you had the movement of multinational corporations like Nike, Apple, etc., etc. And in this period, American corporations shifted to what they call factory-less goods producers, FGPs for short. They don't have any factories, right? These major American multinational corporations, they don't have any factories. And if you think why that's very important, because if you're thinking about, capital, as Marx describes it, is all about the factory, isn't it? The power of the factory, the power of industry. And what do America do in the period of hyperglobalization, 2001, 2008? They divest themselves of factories. They don't have factories anymore. They have value chains, as they call it. And they dominate these value chains by controlling the inputs, which means the technology, and the outputs, the markets where the goods are sold. and the production is handed over to contract goods manufacturers, as they call them, like Foxconn, which has a 300,000 factory in China. Now, if you think how many people is 300,000 people in a factory, the Putilov Works in 1917 was the largest factory in St. Petersburg. It had 16,000 workers, right? So the Foxconn is 20 times bigger than the Putilov Works in 1917. It's absolutely enormous. So you have this huge growth in China. And I mean, you can see why they exempted electronic devices from Trump's latest tariffs, because Apple produced 98% of Apple's output is produced in China. And this is after they've been trying to shift it to India. And after 5 years of trying to shift it to India, they'd moved 1% of production from China to India. So you think moving these value chains is no simple matter, right? So you had this huge growth in China, and GDP per capita grew from $1,000 to 12,000 in 2022. So wages have been rising as well by roughly 10% per annum for 35, 40 years. And so there's been a huge reduction in poverty, a huge increase in the size of the working class, but also a huge this is according to the IMF. The really big benefits in China accrued to a small number of highly skilled workers and to the owners of capital, including foreign investors. Okay, so, all right. And so if you look at China's sectoral employment, and I'm kind of drawing to a close because I don't want to go on forever. The primary sector is agriculture, yeah. Secondary sector is manufacturing, tertiary sector is services. So, and this is in millions of people. So you can see agriculture in 1990 is kind of nearly 400 million. And then by 2020, that had fallen to about 200 million. So you have 200 million people moving from the countryside to the city. So you had this initial massive expansion of the workforce that could be exploited by capital. And then you had genuine capitalism, or market relations anyway, from agriculture through to urban employment. And then you see also the secondary sector, huge increase in manufacturing and a huge increase in services employment. Manufacturing kind of peaked in around 2014, and since then you've had a slight decline in manufacturing employment, but only slight. This has gone alongside a massive increase. And then what else has happened? China's corporations, this is the main corporations. If you look at the USA, it's around, I mean, you see it decline. This is interesting. It kind of declined from 2008 to 20 kind of 14, and then it recovered. So it hasn't changed very much. It's still around 600 out of 2000 are US. And then you look at China, it comes from 100 to about 350. So massive increase, and everyone else is kind of just declining slowly. Right, and then if you look at some other indicators, so for example, robot installation, so thousands of units. China, 290,000 unit industrial robots installed in 2022. It's gone up now. I think it's like 350, 400,000. The latest figures, and you look at everyone else, they're absolutely nowhere, right? And then you look at patent apps. So patent apps is a kind of measure of technological advance. Again, it's a crude indicator. It's not, not every technology, not every patent becomes a technology, etc., whatever. If you look at 2009, 7,009, this is in thousands, so 7,906. By 2023, tenfold nearly rise in China's patent applications. You look at the UK, it doesn't change at all. US slightly increases. Japan increases a bit and then falls. Germany about the same. France about the same. So a huge catch up in terms of technology. China, right? So you have this massive working class, 250 million people. And now, if you're thinking about it in terms of Marxist terms, the organic composition of capital is rapidly increasing. Yeah, you have this huge increase in level of technology and level of fixed capital. So what's going to happen? They're going to want some of their surplus back, aren't they? Because as your technology rises, what happens? You demand, you don't, to equalize the rate of profit, you want a transfer of your surplus back, right? So this is therefore increasing their competitiveness, and it's going to see them demanding their surplus back off America. And they've started to export massive amounts of foreign direct investment and different investments. It's difficult to know exactly how much, but estimates are around $6 trillion of foreign assets. Okay, so what you have therefore is, and I'm kind of going to wrap up. The point about China is that and I go into all this in much more detail in my book, is that this is a challenge to the international rules-based order, right? Which was created in Bretton Woods in 1944 and was revived again in 1991 and crowned by the World Trade Organization. See, this now is challenged by the very, very existence of China. And then China is a great power in the 19th century sense of the term, as described by Blinken. There's a great power competition going on, and there really is Thucydides' trap for America. So the point about a trap is that you try and defend your international rules-based order, but the measures that you take to defend the international rules-based order undermine it, don't they? Paradoxically, how do you defend it? You put up tariffs, you invest in American industry, you have nationalism to criticize your rivals. And what does it do? It creates the multipolar world that you're trying to stop from existing. So that really is a Thucydides trap. What a great, I mean, that book is truly amazing. That history of the Peloponnesian War, if anyone wants to read something over the summer, it's a good read. I think I read it over the summer. It's the kind of thing you need 3 weeks to read. But it does kind of describe that kind of cleft stick scenario of America very, very well. That they're trying to defend the international rules-based order, and the very steps that they take to defend it undermine it. It's really a cleft stick. It is Thucydides' trap. And you see that as well. They model, for example, the invasion of Taiwan. So the Kuomintang, as they fled China, they went over to Taiwan, which is an island 60 miles from China. And America say they're going to defend Taiwan if China try and take it back, which they've promised to do as part of the fulfillment of the China dream. And they've done modeling. What happens if America does try and defend Taiwan, and say, well, on the assumption that China runs out of missiles after 3 weeks, that seems like a very realistic assumption, I must say, that China's going to run out of missiles after 3 weeks. But if you assume that China runs out of missiles after 3 weeks, if you assume that Taiwanese people fight to the death in order to defend their island from China, then America will lose 3 aircraft carriers, 20,000 their navy will be decimated, their power will be wrecked, and they might, on the best case scenario, be able to hold Taiwan. In other words, they're not going to be able to hold Taiwan, is the conclusion that they've come to. So that is a very interesting thing that faces the world over the next few years, is that confrontation over Taiwan, and see what they're going to do, if indeed they do anything. And Trump has already said, Taiwan is the apple of President Xi's eye, he called it. And in fact, do we really want to pay for the Taiwanese when they've been taking all of our chips? I don't think so. Anyway, so you have this shift to this, from this phase of hyper-globalization, then globalization, towards de-globalization. It doesn't mean the world changes automatically overnight. It hasn't changed that much, has it? I mean, there still isn't much class struggle. There still is this ridiculous nonsense of bourgeois politics. But we definitely have a new period. I don't think there's any question about that. And therefore, you can see the contradictions that are incipient in the world are going to become more exaggerated over the next 10 to 20 years. And we'll see what happens as a result. Okay, I'll finish there.
Well, that was great. That was great, Bill. There's lots of questions I could think of, and I'm looking forward to reading the book. I've read the introduction, but I haven't got further than that.
If anyone does, I'll put my email in the chat. So if anyone does want a copy, just email me, right?
Bill, can I? Bill, I can't.
Can I just
Yeah.
You go, Wally. You go.
I can't see the chat.
That's
Can I
good.
write you directly?
If you email me, Wiley or
I'll
Shane,
email you.
then we can
I
fix
just
it.
can't read. I can't read the chat. Okay, I get.
That or Cynthia, she can also help you out. I know.
Yeah,
Okay. Yeah. Right.
I have a copy, so I can send it to you, Wiley. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Just going back to the start a bit, just my reflection. I'll hand it over to the group. Denver is just that because I sort of got involved with communist politics, Marxist politics, just as the Soviet Union collapsed. But I didn't have the sort of investments that most people had in it. You know, look, it didn't mean a lot to me. As a naive as I was then, it just seemed that life in the Soviet Union didn't look all that much different for the average worker than it did anywhere else. So and I never expected change to come from above. So I wouldn't have expected that the Soviet bureaucracy would reform itself. That, they were just my two political sort of intuitions. I don't know how, but of course created a big kerfuffle on the left, and things like Green Left Weekly and traditional Trotskyist organizations, like I was part of one, did try to reorient. They got rid of the party line paper, and they had conferences about what does this mean for the future of the left. Because what happens in that, what I'm getting to is Bill's comment about the 25-year time frame, is in the shadow of world historical events, what happened was that everyone agreed they'd actually been right all along. You know, the Liberals said it was a terrible authoritarian thing and glad to see the end of it. And the state cap said, well, see, that's, it's really been capitalism all along, so it's no big change. And the Orthodox Trots said, well, we told you either to be a working class revolution or to collapse back into capitalism. So all three felt they were justified. I'm not sure where they are 25 years from that, but it's interesting, just to attempt to try and do an analysis in the shadow of world historical events. So I think it's interesting to try to do some of that now, but that was just my 2 cents worth to start off. Questions? Comments?
Can I, Bill, this is Cynthia. Okay, so in the book you make a distinction about crises. I think you call them for capitalism and crises of capitalism. And I would like to hear you talk more about that, and then connect that also to this question of polycrises, and whether that's an applicable term or not. Anyway, so I'd be interested if you could talk more about that.
Sure. Howard? Are you muted? Howard, you're muted. Howard, muted.
There we go. Okay. I'd be interested. I think I was distracted a bit, and in other words, what you said was that, I thought that was wonderful to have that analysis of the falling rate of profit and show that it was rising over this recent period. And I assume the conclusion is it's come to an end, and now we're entering a new period. And I'd like to have you say more about that.
Sure. Okay. Thanks. Right. So first of all, on Cynthia's thing, yeah, that is kind of a thought that came to me, was this, that we can have, in fact, China, I don't know, just an impression, really, a kind of distinction between crisis for capitalism and crisis of capitalism. And the idea is that crises for capitalism is things like climate change, migration. I mean, I'm saying that the crisis, what they call crises, yeah. So climate change, migration, income inequality, discontent, all of these different things, and these are kind of crises that confront capitalism from the outside, if you will. They're created by different things, but they look to solve them within capitalism. So they look, for example, to increase the amount of solar power or wind power, or they want to increase the amount of electric vehicles, etc., etc. But they don't necessarily call into question the existence of capitalism. There's not a social challenge to capitalism at the moment. And in a sense, the only real crisis for capitalism is the crisis of capitalism, the social challenge to capitalism itself. And therefore, you can have what this term polycrisis is very widely used. Adam Tooze from Columbia University uses it, but also different people. Nouriel Roubini uses it. And they took, by polycrisis, they mean just everything's in crisis, really. It's not a deep idea. And in fact, there's no explanation for it, apart from saying it's everywhere. So everything's in crisis, they've noticed. And what's the reason for that? Oh, it's all very complicated. And they can't reduce it to one thing. They certainly can't reduce it to capitalism. And they specifically reject the idea that it can be reduced to capitalism. They say, no. There's all of these different crises going on. It's all very, very complicated. And of course, you can't reduce it to one fundamental reason, capitalism, because that's just a mistake. I think, Wiley, you've started to share by accident. I think you want to.
Yeah, I can't. I'm trying to put my blind pass.
I think you want to unshare if you can.
Yeah, how do I do that? Let's see. I can't.
Shane, can you do that?
I'll have a look. I'll do that.
I'm trying to. I just don't see it well enough to navigate.
Shane will sort it out. Anyway, so however, you can have it seems to me you can have this shift from crises for capitalism, right, to crises of capitalism. And how can that happen? It can happen by things like inflation, for example. So one of the key issues that as a result of the tariff war, what's going to happen? You're going to have a disruption of value chains. There's no question about that. It's already starting to occur. When I was writing the book, lots of people were denying that there was a shift towards a multipolar world. They were denying that there was disruption to value chains. It's obviously preposterous. Of course it was. But no one's denying it now, are they? So the point is that you have the disruption to value chains and you also have tariffs. And what's the effect of tariffs? It's to raise really the price of consumer goods. And in fact, one of the reasons why Trump's so keen on tariffs is that it allows you to put indirect taxes onto the working class, and then corporations don't have to pay as much tax because you can increase the amount of tax that you're getting via tariffs. And what does that do? It raises prices. What happens when prices start to go up? You get wage struggles, essentially. The most fundamental class struggle is over wages, living standards. As long as productivity is right, and this has been characteristic of the last 30 years, you've had productivity rising very quickly, and therefore the price of manufactured goods has fallen. And therefore, even by earning the same amount, you can buy more stuff. And we know that today there's an endless amounts of stuff, aren't there, everywhere, right? It's just rubbish everywhere. My dad inculcated me in a hatred of rubbish. That was one of his weird obsessions that's passed on to children. I have that same obsession that I hate rubbish. But he would have been absolutely going potty today the amount of rubbish everywhere. It's an expression of the cheap price of everything, isn't it? You just throw it away. If prices start to rise, then it's a very different situation, because the cost of consumer goods start to rise. So there will be less rubbish, but there'll also be a recovery of wage struggles. And you can see that that is going to start. I mean, it still hasn't happened yet, but it is present within the current situation. And so you can see these crises for capitalism become a crisis of capitalism, because once you have wage struggles recovering, then you have unions, don't you, coming about, and then you have the blah blah blah, everything follows naturally. So you can see that you have this shift of a crisis for capitalism to a crisis of capitalism. One of the paradoxical effects of the Chinese property crisis that occurred like 3 years ago was that they moved resources into the new economy: EVs, solar, wind power, batteries, all of this lot. So what's going to happen as a result of the new tariffs? They're going to do that even more, right? China's going to have a much even faster transition to the new economy. And you say, well, that's good, isn't it? Because that's going to save the world from climate change. And that is good, obviously. But what's it also going to mean? It's going to mean that China doesn't have to pay for energy. Now, how competitive is Chinese goods going to be when they don't have to pay for energy, right? So that is, if you think there's going to be a tsunami of Chinese goods over the last few years, once they don't have to pay for energy, which you could say within 5 years is possible at the rate of the transition, then you can forget building manufacturing back in America. I'll tell you now. It's not going to be, got no chance of it withstanding that. So that's a kind of very interesting thing. So that, I think we can, this is, if you're doing your future forecasting, you can see these. You've got to be very careful. I know I'm from a trend. Everything's telescoped, right? So this is where the idea of 25 years is so outrageous for the left, because they don't look at more than 3 months is a long time as far as but so you got to be careful about telescoping events, right? But you can see the trends, can't you? I don't really want to get into that, how quickly. I don't really know, to be honest. But you can see that these are the trends that are going to be more and more apparent, right, in the near future, because it's happening now. So, I mean, I wrote a paper, 5 years ago saying China's about to, is about to challenge America for the leadership of the world economy, and it wants, and therefore paradoxically undermines the condition for free trade, because the condition for free trade is that one power rules the world economy, not two. And so paradoxically, at the very moment when China is about to, lead the world, paradoxically, that also undermines the condition for its leadership of the world. Do you see what I mean? Because you no longer have a single power ruling the world international rules-based order. So this is a paradoxical thing. This is Thucydides' trap. It's a great idea. Trudy.
I just wanted to comment that there's something very perverse happening with the tariffs. For example, countries like Mexico, Argentina, or Colombia, Brazil can actually challenge the United States because they're bigger countries with bigger economies, and they have much more leverage. But countries like Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador can't. So what's happening is that all the exports that these countries send to the U.S., coffee, banana, what have you, what the exporters are getting is, okay, you guys have to eat the tariffs. We're not going to take on the tariffs. We're not going to, shift the tariffs to our buyers. So the producers here are freaking out because they basically have to eat the tariffs, sell the goods at the same prices. And so what they're trying to do now here is get the government to kind of give them some sort of subsidy. They're like, look, we are being forced to eat these tariffs. The government is like, we don't have that kind of money. And so what they're saying now is like, okay, so then we can't raise minimum wages. Actually, we should find a way to pay less, because now we have to eat the tariffs. So who's going to pay for those tariffs? Workers in poor countries who are already getting misery wages, and that's why they're migrating, right? So it's a very perverse situation. And when it comes to resistance, these meetings in which I have been translating are, I can't name names because I have non-disclosure agreements, but they're basically organizations around the world which are funded by international cooperation in order to do community building and some sort of resistance, if you will. And what they're concentrating on, all these groups, is because there's less funds now, drastically less funds. They're being told, okay, you have to just target narrowly what you're going to invest the funds for whatever community work you're doing. And it's basic, they're mostly, because most are young, they're concentrating it on very defensive things on the internet, how to avoid surveillance, how to avoid trolling, how to avoid governments or hate groups targeting them online. So it's really not going to much to let's do community building, let's do political education, or so I'm thinking all the resistance funds and training are mainly going online and in very defensive situations. So it's I just wonder how the resistance to this is going to go.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting question. And the other thing is, for example, China is also shifting a lot of stuff through Mexico and Vietnam. So the initial kind of way of trying to avoid tariffs was to relocate factories to Vietnam and Mexico on behalf of China. Part of the reason that the tariffs have been spread out so widely is because China was just moving production around in order to avoid the tariffs. But as you say, who's going to be asked to pay in the end? It's going to be the working class suppliers of goods. It's going to be the working class consumers of goods. And so this is, I mean, and what else can they do from the point of view of capitalism? What else can you do? And that's where, that's where you could have a movement, again, speculating, of a crisis for capitalism, a disruption to the capitalist framework, to a crisis of capitalism, social opposition to this process, as we know about. Tom?
I have a question with respect to Donald Trump. There's much talk that he is quite irrational, that he's hurting the US directly, he's hurting his own country, and one cannot explain what he is doing. But if I understand you correctly, I think you have more of a tendency that there is some rationality behind that there is a long-term trend, that the US is fighting to keep its place on the world market. Well, if you could expand a bit on how to qualify the politics which are now on in the United States.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the point is that Trump, when he came in the first time, 2016, he started the China trade war, didn't he? He moved away from free trade. He implemented tariffs back in 2016, and this was a kind of big brouhaha, oh, how outrageous, it's against globalization, blah blah blah. So Biden comes along in 2020, and what does he do? He doubles the amount of tariffs that Trump introduced. So not only does he keep those tariffs, he doubles the amount of tariffs compared with Trump from 2016 to 2020. And what does Trump do now he comes in 2024? He doubles the amount of tariffs that Biden had. So in one sense, it's exactly the same thing, isn't it? I mean, okay, there's a change of pace. There's not a change of direction. The direction is exactly the same. And I think that that's a very important point to make. Trump is not irrational. He's not some kind of, he's weird outlier, obviously. I mean, don't get me wrong. I can watch the telly like everyone else. But in terms of the kind of historical flow, if you want to put it like that, yeah, there's a clear, it's not just illogical, is it? There's a clear thread. And therefore it's not inexplicable either. He's accelerated the rate of tariffs, yeah. But he didn't invent the idea. In fact, Biden did twice as many tariffs as Trump the first time around, and now Trump is doing more than Biden did. Yeah. And we'll see, you know, again, last time Trump came in, there was a lot of fussing around, wasn't there, first 6 months, and then it all settled down. We'll see exactly what happens once it's settled down a little bit. But the trajectory is quite clear. Yeah. And I think this is what we have to say. It's not inexplicable in that sense. It's perfectly explicable. It's perfectly obvious, in fact, the trend, and the direction is only going one way, which is towards the breakup of the international rules-based order. So paradoxically, while they're defending it, they're also breaking it up, aren't they? It really is a Thucydides trap in that sense. They just can't, like, everything they do to defend it undermines it. That's a paradox, yeah. Barry.
Yeah. There's a couple of things. Just looking at the human material that US imperialism has drafted to bring to the fore to be the personification of the system. I mean, we had George Bush. Yeah, there was Obama. Obama had had qualities, that's for sure. He had a brain in his head. Then we had Trump. Then we had Biden. Now we got Trump again.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, this is a system that, I mean, you remember, you know, the dying days of the Soviet Union when, you know, I can't remember even the names of the people that they had there, but you remember there was some old poor bureaucrat that was up there on Lenin's tomb. Yeah, they had two heavy blokes on either side of him to lift his hand up so he could wave to the crowd. You get the feeling that that's sort of where US imperialism has got to now. That's just one thing. You can tell when a system is pretty much on the ropes when the people that are drafted in to be the personification of it well, basically nuts. You know, let's not put too fine a point on it. Now, the other thing, now I came in on this meeting late, I'm sorry. Now, your book is called War and World Economy, or World Economy and War, or something like that. I live in Perth, Western Australia, just down the road from me here. Your beloved British government and the US government is building a nuclear submarine base, and this is for war. I mean, as soon as they get all those submarines all lined up in a pretty little row and their bases in the Philippines and stuff like that, then the strategy is that they're going to tell the Taiwanese government, okay, now be good little playthings, declare independence, and we're going to watch the mushroom clouds go up. I mean, that's you wouldn't believe it. There's the Labor Party here in Western Australia has locality branches, but it also allows for what they call special interest branches. So there's a branch here called the Foreign Policy Branch. It's written by a particular boffin who actually works for the US State Department, though he's based here in Perth. And I've started attending meetings of this. And what I've just outlined as, you know, the strategy, they talk about this quite freely. He gets major intellectuals from universities in Singapore and the USA, these right-wing think tanks. And as far as they're concerned, the war is on. It's already started. Um, uh, what you were talking about, the war gaming around Taiwan. The last meeting I went to, they outlined it, what they expect to happen, and it's it'd be all, and it's absolutely terrifying what they're planning. And it really does strike me that yeah, the crises of capitalism that the United States is entwined in, the only real way out is through war. They've just got to blow stuff up and, kill them all and let God sort them out. And, the United States will come muddle its way through the war and come out on top and be able to reconstruct their rate of profit. That's a pretty bleak assessment of what's going on. But it looks to me as though that's the way it's going.
Yeah, I mean, I think that they are very explicit about the war gaming, as you say, and the trend, which they think is only in one direction. Yeah, it's absolutely true. And although they say it's not inevitable, they say nevertheless it will happen. So they're quibbling really about what the meaning of the word inevitability. So yeah, what is kind of odd about Australia is that where do Australia make all its money? From China, and that is a weird thing that Australia should so dramatically hook up with America and Britain, when really, if you would have thought, if they had a bit more foresight, they would think, who buys all of our iron ore and coal? And it's certainly not Britain and America, is it? So that is an anomaly, isn't it? That's a strange thing. I mean, people try and work out what the interests of Britain is and why did it separate from Europe. And one of the interesting things I discovered when I was doing the research was during the 2008 financial crisis, the US Federal Reserve lent British banks in the City of London $2 trillion directly. So, I mean, there's massive, massive financial ties between the UK and the US, which explains why Britain doesn't want to hitch its wagon to Europe, really, in any substantive way. So that's kind of interesting, but it's difficult to see what the financial interest of Australia is, given that it sells all of its exports to China. But anyway, that just shows what a strange thing culture is, I suppose. How
could you tack me on to the end? I cannot find this raise your hand thing.
All right. Yeah, Wiley, do you want to go now, and then Howard can go?
No, I'll wait after someone else. I don't want to end. That's what I'm trying so hard. I'm trying to learn.
Don't worry, Wiley. I'll bring you in when you're ready. Right. So if
good. Right,
we take Howard first, and then if you want to come in, then
right.
Howard,
okay.
All right. Okay.
Yeah, the one way of thinking about the current crisis of capitalism, including Gaza, is that we're at the end of an epoch, and that reaches back at least half a millennia. So I wonder, and the end of the domination of the West and white supremacy. So I wonder how your analysis would, if it connects with that kind of that long range picture.
Well, not really, but it is interesting, Gaza, because essentially you have to ask, why are they being so rapacious? And it seems to me that that's an interesting question. And for example, Saudi Arabia now sell twice as much oil to China as they do to the US. And in 2023, there was a peace deal struck between Iran and Saudi Arabia, signed where? In Beijing. And there's also discussion about building because America is worried about the Belt and Road Initiative, which is the way that China is expanding through, it's in foreign investments. And there's also discussion about an alternative route up from Israel through Saudi Arabia, which has a port that ends in Gaza, funny enough. And there are plans for this published by the Israeli Foreign Office that once they've leveled Gaza and cleared it of Palestinians, they're going to turn it into a port because it provides them with access to the Mediterranean. Yeah, kind of grim, very, very grim. But it seems to me that, I mean, I haven't gone into it in any detail in the book, and I can't say I really understand everything that's going on, but you can fit it into the kind of bigger struggle of geopolitics, it seems to me. And that's kind of important because you have to explain why are they so relentlessly killing people and blowing it up in a way that they've not done before. I mean, they obviously have kind of regular attacks on it, but the scale of devastation this time is unbelievably, well, not unbelievable, unfortunately, but it's just on such a huge scale that it's difficult to understand unless it's part of a bigger geopolitical reconfigurement, it seems to me.
If I could just comment on that point. Butch Ware is a candidate for governor of California. He was the vice presidential candidate on the Green ticket. And his rationale for what you've just said, his understanding of what you've just said, is that this is what psychologists call an extinction burst. When you're trying to get rid of bad behaviors and they're on the way out, in order to try and find some kind of balance, they come in with an intensity that is beyond what it could have been anticipated, and so we're in the extinction burst of the epic of imperialism.
Well, I mean, it's interesting, but if you compare, say, the British behaviour, well, the American behaviour in Korea in before the war, where they killed, as I say, 100,000 Koreans before the war had even started. If you take the British suppression of the Kikuyu uprising in the Mau Mau rebellion in the 1950s, they estimate that the British killed between 100 and 300,000 people in Kenya. It's totally unknown, this uprising. Well, it's known, but the scale of the devastation wrought by Britain is not really known. So that's out of a population at the time of about 9 million. So they killed around 300,000, between 100 and 300,000 people in Kenya when they were suppressing the anti-colonial uprising. So in that sense, it is different, but it also isn't different. They have done similar things before. And I obviously think about America and Native Americans, also the British in India. I mean, they killed, in the 1750s, they killed 3 million people in a drought. So, you know, this kind of barbarism is not, unfortunately, atypical. Cynthia.
I don't know. I don't want to take us too far away from what we're talking about, but I just want, on the question of tariffs, two things. One, in the chat on China, George brought up about how the Apple products are not being, how do you say, they're not included in the tariffs. So within this general trend around tariffs, there are definitely individual wealthy corporate interests are looking out for their own interests, and wealthy speculators are looking out for their own interests also. So that you're seeing this back and forth over tariffs creates a very lucrative situation for anyone who has insider knowledge. And they're saying, you know, that Congress definitely is taking advantage of insider knowledge about which tariffs will be imposed and which ones will be dropped, so that benefits can be made for individual wealthy persons. So I just want to bring that out as part of looking at the specifics of the tariffs, not just the general. But then going to the general, I listened to Pepe Escobar. I don't know if you guys follow him at all, but he, a world roaming reporter, and he's defining and describing how the rest of the world is finding a ways to come together that will isolate the U.S. So that, again, this is another, I don't know if it's Thucydides kind of trap, but the fact that what Trump is doing by attacking everyone is creating the conditions for all the rest to come together, regardless of their political affiliations, regardless even of their particular economic circumstances, that they will come together. And it's like, how will the U.S. get peace by going to war against Mars? That kind of stuff. It's really interesting if that really is happening, and I think it probably is. It's fairly well documented when you look at it from the point of view of other countries, especially the global South. So anyway, just want to put that out there, that the preparations for this crisis are taking that form, as well as the question of internal class struggle, the class struggle against imperialism. It's multi forms of opposition to the imperialist hegemon.
Yeah, thanks. Colin.
Hi. Um, Fascinating book. And I remember as I was reading it, the tariffs, I think, went up sort of and down within the first couple of days, just sort of like quite incredibly. So very prescient work. I had another question about the thing that you raised about the rate of profit and accountants against economists, which I think is very interesting. Because, of course, accountants are very necessary if you're going to run a business. You need accountants to work out what you're going to spend and so on. But economists are really about justifying, well, I suppose essentially saying that all production is for value. So that it's got to be. So that assumption runs through it. So you get this thing with the Soviet Union and this. And I've really been struck. It's been an eye-opener for me, your stuff about the rate of profit. Because I should say Michael Roberts and others, say there isn't this rate of profit. And what you say makes sense, but also the sense of like how you get this how do you believe statistics? You know what I mean? It's not, I mean, it's difficult. You kind of take things in assumption. I often, you read something and you assume it's right, but it isn't. And I'm just wondering, my first question really is like, how do you think, how do you get that message across? The idea, as you say, of science, really, which academia has rejected, the idea that you can understand the world, you can just have like opinions and views, as you say, predict things without having laws and so on. And I'm wondering how you think that could be progressed. And also on your question of like, I mean, I really like this distinction between crises for and of capitalism. And I think, what do you see as the chances, or what do you think the conditions would be necessary for a crisis of capitalism, for capitalism? Sorry.
Yeah, the thing about the rate of profit is it's extremely intractable. It's very, very difficult to. I'll be honest, I don't think it's even possible to get people to change their mind. The problem is that they're very, very wedded to. So, for example, if you've been writing for 20 years that we're in a Great Depression, and this is dependent on a rate of profit that's crawling along the bottom of the sea, you're not about to say, oh, I was wrong for 20 years. Oh, by the way, we've just been through the greatest expansion of capitalism in history, and it wasn't a Great Depression. In fact, it was a period it's just not going to happen. And in fact, it hasn't happened. It's very, very difficult to And in that sense, I'm not even sure you can get them to change their mind. So yeah, that is very, very difficult to, and the trouble is as well that reading and working out what is going on is very painful process, because you go through these. I mean, who wants to read the OECD's measuring capital? I mean, come off here. No one's going to voluntarily set themselves that task. So
Recent
yeah,
discussion I saw online with it. I just lost it. I could not understand it. Someone going on a review.
yeah. I mean, well, the thing about it is that all you really have to understand is that you have costs, business costs, which are real costs, and then you have opportunity costs, and opportunity costs are actually profits because they're in the future. And so everything is turned up. So you have a discount of profits is actually not a, because a discount of costs is what we all want when we go shopping, isn't it? Because it means it's cheaper. But a discount of profits means you have less profits. So everything's turned on its head, right? So a discount is actually a reduction in profits, whereas we all think a discount is a reduction in costs. Yeah, you with me? But so this inversion is very, very intractable and very difficult. And you read all of their documents, and if you don't realize they're talking about opportunity costs, not costs, because they don't make it explicit, then you can convince yourself that everything is really not what it appears to be. Now, if you dig a bit deeper, they are very unambiguous that it is opportunity costs, it is net present value, it is not business costs. But yeah, I mean, it's very, very difficult to get people to change their mind. In fact, I'm not sure you can. So yeah, how do we rebuild the left? In the end, Colin, it's going to be social phenomena, isn't it? Because this is why we're marginalized. This is why Marxism's kind of very dead fundamentally, is because there's no social upheaval, is there? So that's what we need. I mean, if you want to have Marxism back, you've got to have social upheaval, haven't you? And so how's that going to occur? I think it is going to occur. I mean, I'm an optimist anyway, but I think you can see that there are problems, really big problems for capitalism, and solving them is going to create social contradictions. So yeah, it is. It seems to me that that is true. And then when that happens, you need to have an answer, don't you? You need to explain to people, well, how do we get in this situation? And that's where your theory comes in. You know, you've got to have an explanation of the world that hangs together. And that's why you need to get to the bottom of all these questions about, you know, the rate of profit, the mismeasure of the expansion of capitalism, blah, blah, blah. You know, you can't just take their word for it. I mean, I've had it, and I say to the people, oh, you know, fixed capital stock is just net present. And then what they do is send you a spreadsheet with figures on. Well, so what? The figures are estimates of future profits. That doesn't show anything at all. You know? It just shows they don't understand the question. You know what I mean? But yeah, what are you going to do? I think it's not easy, is it? I don't know. I think your thing is good, you know, that the whole thing of making capital more understandable, having an explanation of the world. I mean, what can we do? These are the small things we can do. And then hopefully when there's a social upheaval, people start to listen to it. They want to have an explanation. Whether I don't think you're going to get it in academia. I personally don't think that. But yeah, who knows? I mean,
That's really been taken out. So it has been taken out of. I mean, I've been looking into how Marx has been studied historically. You know, I mean, and it was by parties organised in night class, so that you got combination led by knowledge, as Marx said. So you need to, you know, studying these things, and it has become quite academic and relativized. There's lots of different views. That's fine, and that doesn't seem adequate. You know.
No, I agree. The best Marxism was always done outside of university, wasn't it? Yeah.
Well,
so, in my opinion, anyway, it was done. I mean, it was done in. So luckily, the Tsar was so stupid as to send everyone off to a 3-year study camp in Siberia. Lots of the best Marxism was done there, because if you send everyone, all the best Marks in the world, off to a 3-year study camp in Siberia, I mean, Trotsky's cell was lined with books. That's all he did all day, was study. So if you do that with the cream of the intelligentsia, you send them all off to Siberia to study Marxism for 5 years, then they come up with some good stuff. Anyway, George. You're muted,
Bill,
George.
can I go? Can you get me after George? Bill?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'll take you
Yeah.
after George, Wiley. Yeah.
Yeah, George, yeah. Okay.
George, you're muted.
Okay. Hi to everyone. I'm talking you from the belly of the beast. I mean, I'm just 2 kilometers away from a house that they call it white. Okay? Thank you a lot, Bill, for this superb presentation. Sorry for the interruptions; I couldn't hear it all. I would like to raise the following question: do we have a kind of contradiction here? In what sense? In the present situation, we are talking about the world market. The world market is a kind of interdependent world. Okay. But it is interdependent not only in terms of trade, let's say in terms of the market, but it is interdependent also in terms of production. So on the one hand, we have an interdependent world, and on the other hand, we have a kind of US policy that wants to impose tariffs on the basis of a logic that it constitutes a kind of coherent, integral national economy. If you remember, I don't remember the name of this American economist that Marx was criticizing in the Grundrisse, in the appendices of the Grundrisse.
Harry.
Yes.
Yeah, Harry.
And he was criticizing him on the basis that he conceives the relationship of the US economy at the time as being external to the rest of the world. Whereas, so the contradiction I suggest that may exist is that you cannot really have a kind of tariff regime that is based on the idea that you have secluded or isolated integral national economies, so you can introduce trade barriers and profit from, exercising your economic power over the others, while at the same time you exist within an interdependent world, both commercially and productively. And just to give an example about that, when you put a tariff, let's say, to a product, to a commodity, that functions at the same time as an intermediary good. In other words, you have to bring it into your production process with a tariff bestowed on it, but you use it as a commodity in order to produce another final commodity and then sell it either domestically or abroad. It means that you have incorporated the tariff that you have imposed and supposedly harms the exporter. At the same time, it hurts your own production process. It is that disarticulate it in terms of it increases the constant capital, the constant capital invested in your own production process. This increased value is transferred into the value of the final product, and then you export it, or you consume it domestically, and that means that you have to recoup this higher value. So there is a kind of contradiction here between a logic of nationally based economies that does not respect or acknowledge the actual existence of an interdependent world, both commercially in terms of trade relations, but productively too. That's my question.
Yeah, no, good point. I'll just take Wiley first, if that's okay, George.
Well,
Wiley.
just, yeah. First, let me compliment you on a very, as far as I heard, a good job. I can't wait to read your book. I'm particularly interested in what you had, the points you made regarding the falling rate of profit, particularly in identifying the 5 countervailing tendencies, which makes it a tendency. As you were talking about that, I do recall one thing that Marx pointed out, namely about the ability of certain monopolistic forms or organizations or corporations being able to avoid the effects of the tendency of the rate of profit fall. That is, by virtue of their monopolistic position, able to maintain a profit over and above the normal rate. That's something that came to mind when you were speaking about it. The other thing that came to mind, and you know, these ideas formulated as you were talking, and I'm thinking, yeah, it's clear that we're in a situation where there is contention for number one in terms of economic development. But the question for me is, does this represent a contradiction or a competition, if you will, between 2 competing systems, or competition within a given system? Okay. Now, if I understand in terms of capitalism, in terms of where it is now as a declining system, then it seems to me that, I mean, the way I've always looked at it is when I consider China, is to look at China as an entity, taking it at its value, what it says about itself, an entity on a road of socialist construction, as against a system which inevitably, on the basis of the inner laws of capitalist development in and of itself, is on the road to decline. And I don't know, you know, I hear what you're saying. Can you tell me, what is your thoughts on that person? Is it a person or a portion of systems competing within an existing system, namely declining capitalism, or is it a competition or contradiction between 2 contrasting or qualitatively different systems?
Okay, thanks. Right, so first of all, George's point, and then I come on to Wiley's. So George's point, I mean, is very important about the effect of tariffs on, you know, what they call value chains and the very idea of value chains and factorless goods producers. Because once you have a tariff, and this was part of the discussion about Brexit, I remember, was that, for example, if you build cars in Britain, you do the wheels in Britain, then you take it to Denmark, then you take it to Germany, then you take it back to Britain, then you take it back to Germany, then you take, and every time it crosses the border, you're putting on 15%. So you don't just put it on the final good, you put it on all the intermediate goods, and therefore essentially you can't have these value chains. It's as simple as that, because the final price of the good is so high that you can't have these value chains. And therefore, once you go down this road of tariffs, you're going to see a very sharp decline in trade, right? I mean, it's just inevitable. Now, if you want a historical comparison, after the great crash of 29-30 in the US, there was a move towards autarky within the world economy and trade collapsed. It didn't recover until 1960. So you had to go through a world war and then 10 years of recovery after the World War for trade to recover to the levels it had been in the 20s. So this is this is what is posed by the world. And you also see in a return to gold One of the trends is so-called de-dollarization and rise of gold. And so again, this was a trend that was very apparent in the 1930s, where gold wasn't as marginal in 1930, but by 1939, I think like 99.9% of all reserves were held in gold. Very, very small proportion in currency. So you're seeing this trend as well towards gold in foreign exchange. So this is early days, if you will, that these trends are occurring, and therefore it's difficult to anticipate exactly how it's going to work out. I think you have to be clear about that. But it does, as we've talked about, pose the social question, because prices will start to rise. The organic competition will start to rise. Will the rate of profit start to fall? It hasn't yet started to fall, but if you actually look at the figures for the 1970s, the rate of profit didn't really start to fall until the late 1970s, and it crashed with the crisis of 1980, 81, when the special was released, Ghost Town, in Britain. I don't know if you remember that song, but also I've been watching Boys from the Black Stuff, which was a drama that was released about unemployment in Britain. It's very, very bleak. It does remind you of what Britain was like in the early 1980s. It was extremely bleak. We had good fun, didn't we, Colin? Anyway, so it's funny. Anyway, so on Wiley's point, I think this is an interesting question. And I mean, I'm kind of wary about getting into this discussion, right? So, because I remember being in, and I'm not saying it doesn't matter, okay? Don't get me wrong, I'm not a Philistine, but I am wary about where, this kind of thing can take you if you're not careful. Because I was in a left group and I used to do it endlessly for hours and hours. And I'm not sure it actually achieved very much. How do you, whether or not you want to use this category or that category, I'm not sure it does achieve very much in the end. So, because I obviously also know that I'm from a particular tradition. And why did I happen to be in that tradition? It's as simple. I went to the pub and I met someone who happened to be in that tradition. That's what happened. So that's why I'm not in a different tradition. It's just because I happened to meet that person in a pub. If I'd gone to a different pub, I would have met someone from a different tradition. And I would have, so you got to be careful. There's lots of chance things going on, aren't there, that turn you into the person you are. Right. So I'm aware of that. Okay. So therefore, when I'm talking about the Soviet Union, Central Eastern Europe and China before 1978, I call them essentially planned economy, right? Because, and I know that that's not entirely controversial free, because you can discuss how far was it planned, blah, 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 blah. Fair enough. But I think broadly speaking, that describes it, right? In my opinion. And therefore, we can also say, what kind of society was it? Very hierarchical, very bureaucratic, undemocratic, whatever. Okay. So I think you can probably agree on most of the things amongst the left of what the nature of that society was, in my opinion. You can. Then what we saw through the 1990s was a move to the market. Abruptly in the Soviet Union and Central Eastern Europe, prices were deregulated overnight in what they called the Big Bang. There was a huge crisis, but in the end, a form of market capitalism was restored by the late 1990s. And you can see that from the figures. Now, if you look at China also had essentially planned economy. There was zero prices at market prices in the late 1950s, 1960s, by the time that was completed. And I think if you look at the total prices, I put the slide up. In 1978, 3% of total output was at market price, very, very low proportion. And there's a process of marketization. And by the late 1990s, I think 90% of prices are at market prices. And as well, there's also a reconfiguration of state-owned enterprises from being kind of organizations that looked after their staff to working on a market basis. Hence, 60 million redundancies. Think how many people that is. I mean, that is the population of Britain. That's as many people as work in Britain and France put together. 60 million people. All of those were sacked. That's how many people were sacked in China. It's a lot of people, right? So there was this transition to the market, and in fact, it entered the World Trade Organization on the most stringent terms ever applied to a candidate economy in 2001. Why? Because they wanted it to collapse. And in fact, they predicted it would collapse. President Clinton predicted that it would cause the collapse of communism. That's what he predicted. And they thought that it would. Obviously, couldn't be more wrong. but, I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that they're not idiots, but they did predict, it was going to collapse. Anyway, so you have, therefore, in my opinion, a market economy, right? So the question is really, do you call it a capitalist economy?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a matter of opinion to a certain extent. I think, yes, in my opinion, I would say that. However, I can see why people don't want to say that. Yeah, fair enough. I.e., there's still state-owned enterprises, still about 25% of the economy. There's still a kind of idea of collectivity within society. There's also a kind of national dream, they call it the China dream, that I referred to, about national self-development, etc., etc. There has been a rise of living standards. There has been an improvement in healthcare, blah blah blah. So I think so yeah, I have my own opinion, therefore, about that. But yeah, I mean, I hear the argument against it, but I mean, I don't agree with it. But I'm not going to fall out.
If I might Bill, one
Sorry?
other point, because you touched upon it, and I'll be through. You see, for me, the other decisive question is this idea of the market economy. And I refer back to what Deng Xiaoping said in subsequent point, namely this false idea that markets relate only to capitalism. That there's nothing sacrosanct about markets and capitalism. I mean, markets existed before capitalism, during capitalism, and during socialism after capitalism. So, clearly, as long as you have commodity production and exchange, at a level of productive forces at that level, you're going to have markets. And the question is to what interest does the market mechanism serve? Does it serve private interests or does it serve social interests? And it seems that's an important determining factor. So I agree with you that you have to look at these particularities, but to say, I mean, you can't, I don't think one can make an argument because market forces are operating in a given economy that ipso facto that makes that economy capitalist. That doesn't make sense to me.
No, fair enough. I hear that argument, but you could also, I mean, whatever, we're going to just end up in a ping pong match. But I mean, there's lots of billionaires, for example, in the Chinese Communist Party and at the Congress. I think like a third of delegates are millionaires or billionaires, So, I mean, whose interest does it serve? I can remember a student saying, Sir, I've got an important question. So, well, he was a Chinese student. He was the son of a leading Communist Party official. He said, Sir, I've got an important question. So, what is it? I've got to buy 6 black dresses, Chanel, for the women in my family. Okay, that's an interesting question. There's no point asking me that question because I have no idea how you would buy Chanel dresses. You know what I mean? Anyway, whatever. I mean, I'm only saying that as an amusing anecdote, but I'm not. I hear what you're saying. The other question is that to what extent is it subordinate to the law of value and I would say it is. I really do think that and you see that in the construction crisis. Now, okay, how did they handle it? They did deflate the bubble and they did put massive resources into the new economy, but they still face that crisis. However, I mean, I accept that we're going to have a different assessment about that. Fair enough. But I think that's an interesting part of the current situation, I think, is that there certainly China is run on a different basis to the US, and that's part of the problem that the US faces. That in fact it can't compete with China's kind of state-directed elements. It's got no way of competing. Anyway, I think we're at the end of the hour.
People are leaving.
So I hope you enjoyed that. So that's my book. Yeah. Let's say if anyone wants a copy, then contact me. Basically.
Yeah.
Even though you're sort of a group member rather than a guest, Bill, thank you for that. But yeah, I certainly enjoyed it. It's given me more to think about. I have some questions, but I might email them. Have you got the PowerPoints to send me, and then
sure.
We'll get them out to everyone.
And I think as well, if people are around, we are moving on to theories of surface value. We finally got to the last volume, and we are looking at the disintegration of the Ricardian school, which is where Marx talks about the transformation problem.
We did send it
so
to.
If you are around and you fancy coming along for next week, essentially, we're going to start off with Malthus, and then we're going to go on to that. So
we did send it around to the editors of the historical materialism list and the Marx and philosophy list, but I haven't. Now I think about it, I haven't seen it posted there, but we'll see how we go.
Also, if anyone wants to write a review of my book, I have asked if anyone else wants to write a review, then feel free. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I got a few chapters left, but I'm working on the review. It's going well.
How did it read? Okay, that's what I wonder how it read. Was it okay?
Yeah, it read just fine.
It's hard to tell because you get so close to the text. It's just
Bill, will your book be published?